year was 1762, inside the gilded, candlelit chambers of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and beeswax, mingling with the heavy tension that always precedes a royal command. In the center of the room stood a heavy, polished instrument made of wood and wire, a fortepiano. Beside it stood a little girl, no older than 11, dressed in the restrictive, rigid fashion of the aristocracy. Her name was Maria Anna Mozart, but to the world, she would forever be known as Nannerl. She was small, trembling slightly not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of the eyes fixed upon her. These were not just any eyes. They belonged to Empress Maria Theresa, the most powerful woman in Europe, and her court of cynical, bored nobles. They had seen many child prodigies pass through these halls, tricks and novelties meant to amuse and then be discarded. Tonight, however, the stakes were different. A rival musician, jealous of the reputation Nannerl's father had been cultivating, had orchestrated a cruel test. He had whispered to the Empress that the girl was a fraud, that her playing was mechanical and trained by rote, and that if she were pressed to perform a piece she had never seen, a piece designed to be impossible for small hands, she would crumble. The goal was to humiliate her, to expose the charade of her talent in front of the royal court, and to destroy her father's ambitions in a single devastating moment. They pressured her to sit, they pressured her to place her fingers on the keys, and they waited for the embarrassment to unfold. But what happened next left everyone speechless, sending a shockwave through the history of music that would resonate for centuries. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must travel back to the cobblestone streets of Salzburg, where the story began. It was a city of church bells and Baroque architecture, a place where music was as common as the breath in one's lungs. Maria Anna was born into a world of sound. Her father, Leopold Mozart, was a court composer and a man of fierce ambition. He was a loving parent, but he was also a taskmaster who saw the extraordinary potential in his children from a very young age. Nannerl was the firstborn. Before her younger brother Wolfgang ever touched a key, it was Nannerl who showed the signs of genius. By the age of 7, she was already being touted as a wunderkind. Her father taught her the harpsichord with a rigorous intensity that would break most adults. Day after day, for hours on end, she sat at the instrument, her fingers dancing over the keys until they were raw and calloused. While other children were playing in the snow, Nannerl was deciphering complex musical scores, learning to read music before she could read words. But as talented as she was, she lived in a world that was not designed for her. In the 18th century, a woman's place was firmly within the domestic sphere. A woman could be a musician, certainly, but only as an accomplishment, a parlor trick to be displayed before marriage, and then abandoned for the duties of wife and mother. The idea of a woman touring Europe as a professional composer and virtuoso was almost inconceivable. Yet Leopold saw a spark in her that he refused to extinguish. He saw a way to elevate the status of the Mozart family through her gifts. And then, when Wolfgang was born, the dynamic shifted. He was a prodigy of a different caliber, wild and intuitive, but Nannerl remained the disciplined elder sister, the rock upon which the family's musical dreams were built. They became a duo, the Wonder Children, traveling from city to city, court to court. This life was not glamorous. It was a grueling procession of uncomfortable carriages, damp inns, and unfamiliar beds. They traveled in winter, risking their lives on frozen roads to reach the next palace. They were constantly at the mercy of patrons, who were often rude, dismissive, or cruel. The children were poked and prodded by duchesses, wanting to see if they were real, subjected to strange tests to prove their humanity, and treated like performing animals rather than sensitive artists. Leopold drove them hard, knowing that their childhood was a fleeting currency. He knew that Nannerl's window was even smaller than Wolfgang's, because eventually she would grow up, and the world would stop seeing a prodigy and start only a marriageable young woman. By the time they arrived at the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, the Mozart children had already played for kings and princes in Munich and Passau. They had survived the rigors of the road. But Vienna was the capital of the empire, the center of the cultural world. To succeed here was to secure their legacy. However, success in Vienna was also the most dangerous prize. The court was a viper's nest of intrigue. Musicians guarded their positions jealously, and the arrival of 2 children from the provinces claiming to possess musical genius was seen as a direct threat to the established order. This is where the antagonist of our story enters the narrative. History does not record his name, perhaps because he was overshadowed by the very event he tried to sabotage, but we know he existed in the form of the established court musicians. These were men who had spent decades mastering their craft, only to see the spotlight stolen by a little girl and her brother. One of them, a high-ranking Kapellmeister with a cold heart and a bruised ego, decided he would not allow this insult to stand. He could not attack the children physically, nor could he openly accuse them of fraud without proof. So he devised a psychological trap. He approached the Empress with a proposition. He told her that the children were likely a fraud, that their father was a clever manipulator, using simple tricks to deceive the courts. He claimed that Nannerl, in particular, was simply mimicking what she had been taught, like a trained parrot. To prove this, he proposed a test. He would provide a piece of music for her to play on the spot. It would be a composition of his own making, fiendishly difficult, full of complex chord progressions and awkward hand crossings that were considered technically impossible for a child of her stature. The piece was designed to make her look foolish. It was a setup, a public execution of her reputation. If she refused, she was disobedient and arrogant. If she failed, she was a fraud. The Empress, amused by the prospect of a game, and perhaps swayed by the courtiers' jealousy, agreed. The night of the performance was suffocating. The great hall was packed. The chandeliers cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. The whispers of the courtiers created a low hum, like a hive of bees sensing danger. Nannerl walked out, her small hand resting in her father's. She was dressed in a white corseted dress, her hair powdered and piled high, making her look like a porcelain doll. She looked out at the sea of faces, painted cheeks, powdered wigs, and eyes that gleamed with anticipation. She didn't know the specifics of the plot against her, but she could feel the malice in the air. She could sense that this was not just a concert. It was a trial. Her brother Wolfgang, only 6 years old, stood beside her, unaware of the political undercurrents, just excited to make music. But the attention of the court was fixed on Nannerl. The rival musician stepped forward, a smug smile playing on his lips. He bowed to the Empress and then turned to the child. He placed a thick stack of parchment on the music rack of the fortepiano. The paper was covered in notes, dense and black, looking like a swarm of insects. "This little one," the musician said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear, "is a piece composed by our emperor's own court. It requires a hand that has known the instrument for decades. If you are truly the musician they say you are, surely you can play the first few pages." It was a lie. The emperor had not composed it. It was a trap. The pressure was immense. The room fell silent. Leopold Mozart stood behind his daughter, his hands clenched behind his back. He knew the piece was impossible. He knew his daughter had never seen it. He likely considered stopping the performance, grabbing her hand and running, but to do so would be to admit defeat. It would ruin them. He had to trust her. He had to trust the thousands of hours of practice he had forced upon her. Nannerl approached the instrument. The bench was high, so she sat on a cushion to reach the keys. She looked at the music. To a trained adult eye, the sheet music was a nightmare. But Nannerl did not see notes of malice. She saw patterns. She saw structure. She had been trained by her father to understand the language of music more fluently than her own native German. She did not panic. Instead, she did something that stunned the room. She took a deep breath, adjusted her sleeves, and did not play the first page. Instead, she placed her hands on the keys and played the piece from memory after looking at it for only a few seconds. Or, as some historical accounts suggest, she played it with such precision and feeling that she transmuted the composer's intended trap into a masterpiece. Her small fingers, which a rival had thought too weak to span the octaves, moved with a blur of speed. The fortepiano, which was a quieter, more percussive instrument than the modern grand piano, sang under her touch. She didn't just hit the right notes, she accentuated them. She brought out the melody that the jealous musician had buried under layers of technical difficulty. She played with a fire and a passion that contradicted her doll-like appearance. The courtiers stopped whispering. The Empress leaned forward in her throne. The rival musician's smile froze, then crumbled into a look of utter disbelief. He checked his sheet music, thinking perhaps she was playing something simpler, and he had lost his mind, but she was playing his piece. She was playing his trap, and she was conquering it. She navigated the impossible hand crossings, the rapid arpeggios, and the dissonant chords that were meant to trip her up. She turned the cacophony into harmony. When she reached the end of the excerpt, she did not stop. She transitioned into an improvisation, a skill the Mozart children were famous for. She took the themes from the trap piece and wove them into a melody so beautiful, so complex, and so pure that it silenced the room entirely. She was no longer a little girl trying to please a court. She was a giant, channeling the divine. The music seemed to come from somewhere else, flowing through her and out into the cavernous hall. As the final chord resonated through the room, fading into the rafters, there was no applause. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that happens when the human mind is struggling to process what it has just witnessed. The rival musician stood pale and trembling, his scheme having backfired spectacularly. He had tried to embarrass her, to expose her as a fraud, but he had instead provided the stage for her greatness to shine the brightest. Then the Empress stood up. This was the signal. The room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. The nobility, usually so reserved and critical, were on their feet. They were shouting, they were cheering. Some were weeping at the beauty of what they had heard. Empress Maria Theresa, known for her sternness and unyielding nature, walked down from the dais. She approached Nannerl, who sat frozen at the keyboard, her chest heaving, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The Empress did not speak of the trap or the rival musician. She simply reached out and handed the little girl a royal snuff box, encrusted with diamonds and gold. It was a gift of immense value, a gift usually reserved for ambassadors and generals. It was a public acknowledgement that Nannerl Mozart was not a fraud, not a trick, but a true artist. She then summoned Wolfgang, who was grinning broadly, and gave him a suit of court clothes. But the eyes of the court remained fixed on Nannerl. She had survived the fire. She had turned the attempt to embarrass her into a moment of triumph that left everyone speechless. In the days that followed, news of the event spread like wildfire through the European courts. The little girl who silenced Vienna became a legend. The Mozart family's fame was secured. They were invited to play in Paris, in London, in The Hague. They met kings and queens, composers and philosophers. But amidst the glory, a quieter, more tragic story was unfolding. While that night in Vienna proved that Nannerl possessed a talent equal to, or perhaps even exceeding her brother, in that moment, it also highlighted the inescapable reality of her gender. The Empress praised her, yes, but the praise was laced with pity. When the performances were over, and the audiences had gone home, it was Wolfgang who was encouraged to continue. It was Wolfgang who was pushed to compose, to innovate, to become the Mozart history remembers. Nannerl was told, implicitly and eventually explicitly, that she had done well, but now it was time to grow up. As Nannerl entered her teenage years, the tours stopped. She was no longer a cute child. She was a young woman, and a young woman touring Europe without a husband was scandalous. Leopold Mozart made the decision to leave her behind in Salzburg, while he took Wolfgang on further tours to Italy to further his education and career. For Nannerl, the music did not stop. She continued to play, to teach, and even to compose in secret, but the world stopped listening. Letters between Nannerl and Wolfgang reveal a deep bond and a shared language of music, but also a heartbreaking disparity. In one letter, Nannerl sends Wolfgang a piece of music she has composed, asking for his opinion. His response is lost, or perhaps he never replied with the gravity she deserved. Historians have found that some of her early compositions may have even been published under Wolfgang's name, a common practice at the time to make them more marketable, or perhaps a result of a father who saw only one son as the vessel for the family genius. The girl who left the Schönbrunn palace speechless that night faded into the background. She became a wife, a mother, and a teacher. She married a magistrate named Johann Baptist Franz von Berchtold zu Sonnenberg and moved to a small town, far from the imperial palaces and the roaring applause. She had 3 children, but only one survived to adulthood. She lived a life of quiet domesticity, the very life the court had expected of her. But one must wonder, as the years went by and her brother became the immortal Amadeus, what went through Nannerl's mind on quiet evenings. Did she sit at the piano in her parlor, her hands no longer small and calloused, but older and wiser? Did she play the impossible piece from Vienna, the one meant to humiliate her? Did she marvel at the girl she used to be, the girl who stared down the most powerful woman in Europe, and the jealousy of a court and won? The pressure she faced that night was not just about a piano recital. It was the pressure of a society that constantly sought to diminish women, to put them in their place, to test them until they failed. The rival musician represented the world's skepticism toward female genius. He believed that a little girl could not possibly possess the depth of soul required for true artistry. He believed that by pressuring her, he could break her. He was wrong. She played not just to survive, but to transcend. She played with a fury and a grace that proved art has no gender. The story of that night serves as a poignant reminder of the countless voices in history that were silenced not by a lack of talent, but by a lack of opportunity. Nannerl Mozart was not a victim in the traditional sense. She was a victor in the battle of the Schönbrunn palace, but she lost the war of history. Her name's a footnote in her brother's biography, a shadow cast by a giant. Yet, looking back through the lens of time, we can see her clearly. We see the little girl in the white dress, sitting on the cushion, facing the music rack with the terrifying sheet music. We feel the tension, the malice, and the silence. And then we hear the music. Not just the notes, but the spirit behind them. The refusal to be small. The refusal to be embarrassed. The sheer, unadulterated will to create beauty in the face of ugliness. In the final years of her life, long after Wolfgang had died tragically young and been buried in a pauper's grave, Nannerl was visited by a young student named Vincent Novello. He found her old, but her mind sharp. They spoke of the old days, of the miracles they had seen. She played for him, and he noted that her touch was still exquisite, that she still possessed the magic that had silenced an empire. She lived to be 78 years old, carrying the memory of that night within her, a secret treasure that no one could take away. The title of our story promised that what happened next left everyone speechless. That night, in the glittering heart of the Habsburg Empire, it was the truth. The arrogance of the rival was silenced. The cynicism of the court was silenced. But the silence that followed was brief, swallowed by the applause and the inevitable march of time. Today, we can restore that silence. We can listen to the echoes of Nannerl's piano and hear a story not of embarrassment, but of triumph. It forces us to ask ourselves, how many other little girls, pressured by the world to sit down and be quiet, have stood on the precipice of greatness, only to be pulled back by the heavy hand of expectation? And how much beauty has the world lost because we only allowed the Wolfgangs to speak, while the Nannerls were forced to lay down their instruments and fade into the shadows of history? As the last note fades from our imagination, leaving us with a profound sense of wonder and a touch of melancholy, we realize that history is not just a record of what was written down, but also of what was left unsaid, played, but not heard. The little girl at the piano played her heart out, and for a moment, she changed the world, proving that genius is not determined by who you are born as, but by the fire that burns within you, a fire that no amount of pressure or embarrassment can ever extinguish.